The Notion API. You've heard all the hype about it, but what exactly is it? Well, my friends, the Notion API is essentially a set of tools that you can use to connect other web apps and tools up to your Notion workspace. Or if you want, you can even use it to build entirely new applications and tools on top of Notion. It can read data from your Notion workspace, it can create new pages, it can add blocks to those pages, update databases, it can do a lot. But if you're not an experienced programmer, then working with any API, let alone the Notion API, can be a pretty intimidating experience. And reading through the API docs, trying to figure out how those work, you might as well be looking at Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? Well, wrong. As of today, you are finally going to go from confused to confident when it comes to working with the Notion API and reading those docs, because this is a complete crash course for working directly with the Notion API using some beginner level JavaScript. Now don't worry, even if you are not a confident JavaScript coder, I think that if you can follow along with this video, you're going to be, well, a lot more confident about your coding skills by the end of it, and you are going to understand how to work with the Notion API, and actually pretty much any API, because as I've learned, working with one API kind of teaches you how to work with APIs in general. And this video is going to be very beginner focused because I actually learned how to code myself just this year. This summer was when I started learning JavaScript, and I found myself quite frustrated with a lot of API-centric tutorials in the past because they were made by developers who kind of assumed that you already knew a lot of this beginning kind of setup stuff that you're supposed to do to work with them, and I didn't know that. So in this video, we are not going to skip those parts. We are going to go through everything that you need in terms of setup and tools and knowledge and code for working with the Notion API. And my hope is that this video gives you all the tools you need to start using the API to build your own stuff. And because learning sticks so much better when we actually build something, in this video, we're going to build a complete Pokedex inside of Notion. Here is my Pokedex. I have all 905 Pokemon inside of it. We've got their stats, we've got their types, we have their pictures. There's even a page for each one with their flavor text. But the coolest part of this Pokedex, and the reason that it's pertinent to this tutorial, is that there was zero manual data entry used to create this Pokedex. All 905 of these Pokemon were brought into this Notion page auto-magically using the API. I built a simple script that fetches all these Pokemon from another resource, the PokeAPI, which is great for learning APIs, and formats the data and then sends it over to Notion and automatically creates these pages. And that is what we're going to be building in this video. I'm going to go step by step with you to recreate this script, and we're going to take a very iterative approach. We're going to start with what's called an MVP, or minimum viable product, which is extremely simple, uses very little code, and just demonstrates how to connect to an API and get data from it. And then as the video goes on, we're going to flesh out the script. We're going to bring in all the information we want, like their names and their pictures. We're going to format some of that information to make it look a bit prettier. And by the end, you're going to have a lot more skills when it comes to working with the Notion API and even with coding in JavaScript. Now, before we get started with the tutorial overview, you might have this question kicking around in your head, which is, Tom, how much JavaScript do I need to know to actually follow along with this tutorial? And I'm going to go ahead and make a bold statement here. I think you can follow this tutorial even if you've never programmed in JavaScript before. And the reason I'm saying that is I actually learned JavaScript this year, but more importantly, when I've learned basically anything, all my learning projects, in many cases, I'll sort of reach way out of my comfort zone and get kind of a handhold in an area that feels like unknown territory. And that actually kind of allows you to do what's called backfilling, where you kind of now have this North Star in that unknown territory. And that allows you to go back and go into some of the more beginner, fundamental oriented resources with more direction. And that gives you more context for what you're learning at that beginner level. That said, if you do already have some basic familiarity with JavaScript, like declaring variables and creating loops, that kind of thing, you are going to more readily understand some of the code we're going to go through here. However, if you have never coded in JavaScript before, I have strived to make this and the companion blog post for this video a one-stop shop resource for going from basically zero to knowing what you're doing, not only with the Notion API, but also with coding JavaScript. So you will find beginner-oriented resources, free ones, linked in the description down below, linked in that blog post, and in the blog post version, I also have little toggly accordion things that explain a lot of the concepts that I'll probably go a little bit faster over in this video. However, look at the length here. This is not a short video, and I'm not going to be going super fast. I'm more interested in thoroughness here. I'm more interested in making this a fundamentally useful evergreen resource. So With that being said, let's get into the tutorial by first going over what exactly we're going to be doing here. Let's talk about kind of the spec. So let's go through the spec first, and we'll just kind of look at this Pokedex here to get sort of a feeling for what we're going to be building. So what we want is to bring in all 905 Pokemon. If you wanted to keep it to 151 or however many you wanted to, that would be very easy as well. And we want to bring in several different stats. So I'm going to go over to this by number view that I've created here, and we'll look at the stats we want to bring in. So we want to get the Pokemon's number. We want to get its name, its category. So like seed Pokemon, lizard Pokemon, all these cool things here. We want to get their types, and if they have more than one, we want to show both. We'll get their generation. We can actually get their sprite, which is pretty cool. And then I want to get their height, weight, and then their base stats. So HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. I also, if we open up one of these pages here, I really want to get their flavor text. And then I want to be able to generate automatically a link to the Bulbapedia entry for this Pokemon. And that will happen for each Pokemon that we're going to be building. Now, in most Notion tutorials I actually show you how to set up the Notion database that you're going to be using. In this case, I'm going to skip over that. I have created a template version, and it's linked in the description down below. So if you want to know how to build this kind of thing, I've got Notion database tutorials, all kinds of projects that like actually work with the Notion UI itself. So check those out if you are a little rusty or want to learn more about Notion databases. But to get started with this project, just go to the description link down below and you'll find this Notion Pokedex template. And there will be a duplicate button up in the corner so you can duplicate it into your own workspace. And then it's basically just like a blank version of my finished Pokedex. I have one Pokemon in here as a reference, but otherwise it's pretty much just a blank set of properties and a database here. So that is what we're going to be using, and I have my own little video version right here. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this little call-out block here because I don't need it. I'm going to be using this to build this whole pipeline within this video. And to move on, I want to give you just a high-level overview of exactly what it is we're going to do here. So to give you a broad strokes intro, the first thing I will point out is this PokeAPI, and you can find this over at pokeapi.co. And this is just this amazing resource that has pretty much any piece of data about Pokemon that you could possibly want in the format of an API. Now, when I say API, what exactly do I mean? API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is basically a set of instructions, a set of tools that web applications give to the public, or at least people that they give authentication to actually do things with those web resources. So you can either get data from a web resource, which is what the PokeAPI allows us to do. With some other web apps, we can actually push data to them, or we can manipulate data that's already there. And that's what we can do with the Notion API. This is a very flexible API and lets us get data from Notion, push data to Notion, create pages, append blocks to those pages, all kinds of really cool stuff. So what we're going to basically do is pull data from the PokeAPI. We're going to feed it through some code that we're going to write to make the data in the format that we need, and then we're going to push that data to Notion to create a new page for each Pokemon inside of our Pokedex. And if we look right here, there's actually this really convenient try it now box. And actually, I think the PokeAPI is mainly built as an educational resource. I have found that this is a wonderful way to start playing with APIs and learning how to use them because number one, it's what is known as a get only API. So you can't really screw anything up. You can only get information from it. And number two, it's a Pokemon based API. What could be more fun to mess around with than a Pokemon API? In my humble opinion, absolutely nothing. So yeah, right here we have this try it now button and we can see that we are accessing its Pokemon, what's called endpoint, and then we're passing Ditto as the Pokemon we want to see. And if I change this to, let's just say Charizard and hit submit, I'm going to get the resource for Charizard. So we can start digging into this. And if you watched my video on using make.com to bring YouTube data into Notion, you may have seen the part where in the make.com setup, we actually went through some data that looks very similar to this. This is basically the API responding with a bunch of arrays and objects in JavaScript. So we can actually look through this. And this is basically JSON data. We can view the raw JSON if we want to, but it's much easier to go through and actually look at the drop downs here. And we can see we have abilities here. We can toggle that closed. We have forms. And I'll point out a few really useful pieces of information. So we have the name right here, Charizard. We have the ID, it's Pokemon number 6. We have its stats. So I've got its base stat for HP, its base stat for attack, and so on. And we even have sprites. So we can go in here and they've actually uploaded all the sprites from the Pokemon games for each Pokemon, which will allow us to display the Pokemon pictures inside of our Notion template here. So essentially what we want to do is grab information from this Poke API about each of these Pokemon, and then we want to send it on to Notion. And I'm going to break out the whiteboard here because I think it's going to be a lot easier to explain what we're going to be doing if you can see it visually. So essentially, we are going to be interfacing with the Poke API first, and we're going to do that from our own development environment, which is going to run on something called Node.JS. And that is basically a back-end way to run JavaScript on a server. So that is what Glitch is basically going to give us. And then we are also going to be working with the Notion API. So here's a bit of a breakdown on the process we're going to go through. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually request information from the Poke API. So I'll just write rec here. And if that request is successful, we are going to get a response. So the response as it is basically raw information, and we can't just send it on to the Notion API. We first need to actually wrangle with that information and put it into a format that Notion wants. And also we want to pull out only the information that we really want to actually track, which I just went through in that little Pokedex example. So HP, stats, that kind of thing. So first we are going to parse the data. Then we're going to create what's called an object that holds all the data that we want in particular. And that object is going to correspond to a singular Pokemon. So we're going to get all the Pokemon, and each one will have an object, which we will put into one giant array. And then finally, we are going to format the objects in that array, or basically make new objects out of them that are in the format that Notion actually wants. And then once we've done that, we will send that information to the Notion API with what's called a post request. And while I'm writing that, I should note that this is called a GET request. And then if that request is successful, a new page will be created at Notion, and then we will get back a response that we will simply log. So this is essentially a high-level overview of what we're going to be building. And now that we've kind of gone through it, let's actually start to build this and get into the fun part. Maybe that'll work. I'm not sure. All right, so it is building time, my friends, and we are going to be building this on a platform called Glitch, which you can find over at glitch.com. And the reason we want to build it on this platform is Glitch basically gives you an entire environment for writing web applications in the cloud. So you don't have to have an IDE installed, you don't even need a text editor, and you don't need Node.js on your computer. This is basically going to give you everything that you need, and you can also write your code in their editor. So to start, you can go over to glitch.com, and I will have the link to my code in the description. So if you want to study it, you can do so. I have meticulous comments on every single line of the code in the actual editor here. And then I have a no comments version as well if you just want to study it without any of those comments. So once again, if you just want to either get this running for yourself without any effort, or you want a very easy starting point for making modifications, you can simply hit remix right there. But we are actually going to be building this from scratch. So I'm going to go over to the Glitch homepage. And once you have an account with Glitch, you can just hit new project. And then it's going to give you a whole bunch of different starter apps here. So I'm going to choose Glitch Hello Node. And that is because we want to use something called Node.js, which once again is sort of a back-end server runtime, it's called, for JavaScript. It basically lets us run JavaScript on servers where classically you can only run it inside of the browser. And that basically just gives you like the ability to write JavaScript, which a lot of people like to do, pretty much anywhere they want. So I will choose Glitch Hello Node as my little project starter. And it's going to basically bring in a whole bunch of stuff that gives us sort of a shortcut, like a head start. So once this is actually spun up, I'm going to have that there. And I guess I have it now. So quickly, we can run through all the things that we've been given. We have a basic readme.markdown file, which has got some explanations of everything going on in here. We have a package.json, which is basically going to have information about different packages that we are bringing in, like external libraries, things like that, along with some other information about our app. So we'll be modifying this in a little bit. And then we have a server.js file, which basically just runs this server here. We are not going to be messing with this at all. In fact, if I go over to my actual glitch project, you will notice that I have deleted a lot of the things that it automatically generates. But one thing I haven't deleted is this server.js, and I believe we need to actually have this here. So the first thing I want to do is create for myself a brand new file, which I'm going to call index.js. I'll click add this file, and now I have it added to my little list here. Now glitch is going to look like this for you. I'm actually going to turn on a set of little CSS customizations that I've created for glitch, which will make it a lot easier for me to fit my face on the screen along with the code that we're going to be writing here. So don't freak out if your editor doesn't look like this. I have actually messed with it using a little CSS extension called StyleBot, which is right here. So before we start writing code and start trying to mess with the APIs, we need to set up our Notion workspace so that we can actually connect with it inside of this glitch project here. So I'm going to go over to Notion now. And if I go to my settings and members area, and then I go to connections, and I believe you could get to it by my connections as well. Yes, so either connections or my connections. At the bottom of this little page here, we have this develop or manage integrations link. So let's go ahead and click that. And this is where we can actually create an integration that will allow us to use the Notion API and allow the Notion API access to our particular workspace. So to get started, I'm going to click new integration right here. I'm going to call this Notion Pokedex. And I'm not going to worry about the accent over the E for this tutorial. I'm going to call it video demo. And that's actually all I need to do. So I do want to make sure that it has these following content capabilities: reading, updating, and inserting. And then I don't actually need to give it user information. So I'll click that radio button right there and I will hit submit. I also want to make sure that this is set as an internal integration. I'm not building a public integration. I'm not building an app for any of you. I'm teaching you how to build your own, so I can leave that as internal. And here I can actually get my integration token. Now this is something that you do not want to share with anybody else. You can copy it, and I'm actually going to delete it after this tutorial is done. So yes, you want to keep this secret from anybody else, because this is basically what would allow anybody to access your integration and then mess with any Notion pages that this integration has access to itself. But now that I got this, I want to come over to my brand new glitch instance here, and I want to create a file called .env. And this stands for environmental variables. This is basically going to be the place where we will store our Notion integration key that we just copied, as well as the ID to our database that we want to work with. And the cool thing about .env files on Glitch and in many other places is they are typically not shared when you say remix a Glitch project, like you can do with mine, or when you say push code to GitHub if you're working on it with like Git. So I want to add variables inside of this little .env file. The first one is going to be Notion in all caps _key. And in there, I'll paste my little secret key there. And then the other one is going to be Notion _database _ID. And I can go over to my Notion database here and make sure that I'm on the one that I want to actually use. So Notion Pokedex video. And I will actually open up this database as a full page because I want to get the ID of the database itself. This is something that's important to realize. So if you're not very familiar with Notion databases, I would highly recommend checking out my Notion database full video tutorial. But I will point this out here one more time. This page is not actually the database itself. It contains the database. So if I have this here, I want to make sure I can open it as a full page and verify that I'm on the database itself. And I can verify that when I go to the three-dot menu here by looking for the presence of this little lock database option. If I don't have it, then I'm not actually on a database. Now I don't want this option. I actually want this copy link option here, because what I need to do right now is get the database ID from this page's URL. So I'm going to open up just a little notepad window here and paste that URL there to show you how you can get your database ID. When you get the URL for your Notion database, after this final trailing slash and before this little question mark V equals, you're going to find your Notion database ID. So that right there is the piece of data that you want. So I'll copy that, and then going back over to my little .env file, I'm going to paste that in there. And now my env file is perfectly set up, and there is nothing else that I need to do. So again, if you want to use my code and you just want to start generating a Pokedex, that is all you really need to do over on the glitch side. The only other thing you need to do is come back to Notion. And I'm gonna go back to my Pokedex video area. I can do this on the database itself, but I'll do it here. I wanna come back to the three-dot menu here, come down to the connections menu, and then I want to find the integration that I just created, which was Notion Pokemon Video Tutorial. So I've got here Notion Pokemon Video Demo. We'll have access to this in all child pages. This is that cascading permissions that I often talk about. So I'll click confirm here. And now the reason I did this is I want to demonstrate this to you. I can see that this integration or connection has access to this page. And if I come into the database itself, it's also got access. And I can see here, it's from Notion Pokedex Video. That is the page that has actually been granted access for this connection, which means all child pages, including this database, are available to this connection as well. And once you've got that done, if you've got my code handy in your glitch instance, you can actually just run that index.js file in the terminal. You would type node index.js inside of the terminal here, and that would start bringing Pokemon into your little Pokedex here. But we want to go further. We want to actually build this and find out what is actually happening. So to do that, I'm going to first bring that over here just so you can see my face on the side of your screen. We're first going to start working with the PokeAPI because we want to start getting information from it and seeing what that looks like. So to do that, I want to go back to my index.js here. So first, we're going to go over to the PokeAPI. And the first thing that I want to show you here is the check out the docs link here, which you should also find right there at the top of the menu. This is basically your Bible for the PokeAPI. It will show you how to get access to pretty much any piece of information that you want, and you will see that right here. So I'm actually going to go down to Pokemon, and underneath Pokemon, which is kind of a general category, I'm going to go to Pokemon again, and we can see here that if we send a GET request to this URL, which I will show you how to do in just a second, we're going to get all of this information for the specific Pokemon that we pass it. And we can see right here that we can pass either a name, so that would be like Charmander, or we can pass an ID, which would be, I believe, 4 for Charmander. So either way, we're going to get all of Charmander's information that is listed here if we pass that particular URL. So to do this inside of our code, we're actually going to use a JavaScript library that is called Axios. And you can find that over at axios-http.com. I'll have that linked on screen. And this is basically a library that's going to allow us to more easily interface with APIs and get information from them, as well as send information to them. So I'm basically going to start this process out by bringing in Axios into our glitch project and actually kind of writing this function here. So we're going to go over to glitch. And the first thing I want to do is pop up my drawer here and head over to this little package.json area. And you'll notice up here that I have this add package option here where I can actually add packages from what's called NPM. And NPM is a package manager for Node. It's called Node Package Manager. It's basically this giant repository of all sorts of useful things, useful packages that you can bring into your code and then use instead of having to write tons and tons of code for yourself. So we're going to bring in our Axios package. So if I just search for Axios, you'll be able to find it. I'll click right there, and then you'll notice that Axios has been added to my dependencies right here. Hey there, Future Tom here with a little note about these packages here in package.json. When I recorded this tutorial 3 months ago, we were on Axios 1.1.3, which was working just fine. Today, January 11th, 2023, we are on 1.2.1, which is also working just fine. But after I finished recording this tutorial, they updated to 1.2.0, which was not working. So I do want to let you know really quick that if you have a package that isn't working at any point in the future, maybe an update happens and it breaks something, you can always roll it back to a stable version that you know works. In this case, we know that 1.1.3, the package version that I was using in this tutorial, actually works. So here in package.json, I can actually delete this 1.2.1 and I can go 1.1.3, and that will roll it back to the 1.1.3 version. We can go up here and actually see that now it's prompting us to update. I could do that, that would work. But if you wanted to use 1.1.3, you could just type it there. You can also go into your terminal and you can do npm list And that's going to bring up a list of all the different packages in your project. If we go up here, we can actually find Axios, and here it is, 1.1.3. Now we have a couple of warnings here, but we can see that making that change in package.json actually did make the change here on Glitch, so we are using this version of the plugin. One other note, I am going to have a pinned comment below this video with any other changes that may happen, since I can't change the video once it's live, but things that this code may rely on might change in the future. So check that pinned comment if you have any other problems. The other one that I want to bring in is actually Notion. So if I search for, I believe, @Notion HQ, so Notion HQ/client is the Notion API, what's called SDK, I believe. So I can bring that in there as well. And now my project is going to have access to both of these external packages. And we don't need to bring in a package for the PokeAPI because number one, I don't even think one exists. Maybe it does. I can actually search for it. But number two, we are going to be working with it entirely through Axios. So it actually looks like there are a bunch of them. We do not need these. We're going to use Axios in general. And I picked Axios because I'm going to be doing some tutorials for a platform called Pipedream in the future, which is mega powerful. And they use Axios as a sort of default HTTP client in many of their tutorials. So that's what I've learned, and I think it would be useful for you to learn as well. So what do we actually do here? Well, the first thing we want to do is actually bring in what are called require statements so we can use those external packages that we've just created. If we look over at my project, we can see that the first thing we want to do is bring in our Axios client here. So I'm going to define a variable, and I'm writing JavaScript in case you aren't quite sure or haven't really messed with it before. And I'm going to call it Axios, and then I'm going to set it equal to require Axios. So I've now brought that into my code. I'll do the exact same thing for Notion as well. So I'll do const Notion equals, and let's check out, because I believe this one's a little bit different. Yep. So it's client. There we go. And then the next thing we're going to do is create a variable called Notion. And I'll just copy this in as well. This is going to create a variable called Notion that basically allows us to access that Notion integration key we just created. And you can see here, we're accessing it through process.env, that .env file, .notion key, which if we go back to our env file just to look, we can see is the key that corresponds to that particular value. So that's how we're getting it into our actual index.js file here. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is very simply get some information from the PokeAPI here. And the way that we're going to do that is by calling a method called axios.get. Now, if we look at the Axios documentation here, we can actually see exactly what we're supposed to do. We call axios.get, we pass it the URL that we want, and then we can put a .then clause where we basically define a function for how we're going to handle this. And then we can also have a catch block for handling any kind of errors. So let's go ahead and do that. And one thing we are going to want to do, which I'll scroll down here to sort of highlight here, is we are going to want to eventually put this into an async function. And that is because Axios is a library that returns what's called a promise from this get method here. And that gets into some pretty intermediate JavaScript. I'm going to be putting some resources in the description down below in case you are curious about that. But the gist of it is the thing that this is going to return first is a promise to either get the information successfully later on or to tell us that it failed to do so. And because the promise itself doesn't really hold any information, if we don't put this in what's called an asynchronous function and tell our code to wait for this to finish, then we're going to have other things kicking off that would need the information from this piece of code right here, but aren't going to get it. So we kind of want to make sure that this totally finishes up before we do anything else. So going back to how we have things set up here, we can see that we are creating what I'm calling the Poke array, which is going to be an array full of Pokemon. And then we're doing everything else inside of this asynchronous function. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go with another const here. I'm going to call it Poke array equals just an empty array there. And then I'm going to create myself an asynchronous function. And inside of this function, we will actually do our stuff. So very, very simply, we just want to get some information about a single Pokemon from the PokeAPI. So let's go over to the PokeAPI one more time. And let's look at this little piece of text right here. This is our Pokemon endpoint where we can get things like the name, the weight, the height, stats, all kinds of cool stuff. So I'm going to copy this right here. And I'm going to start writing my first little bit of code here. I'm going to call this await axios.get. Oops. I'll paste this in here. And then let's just put a 1 here to get information about the very first Pokemon, which is Bulbasaur. From there, we want to pass the result from this into a .then function, but to keep my code a little bit cleaner, I can actually put it onto another line. So I can do .then, and then I'll use what's called an arrow function to basically take the response from this, put it into a variable called poke, which is my favorite food, and then do something with that variable. So the first thing we're going to do is simply log it. So I'm going to do console.log poke. We also want to add error handling here. So we're going to add a catch block. It's going to be kind of the same thing. I'm going to call this error. If there's an error, it's going to be thrown into that error variable, and we will console.log the error if it happens. The last thing we need to do is actually invoke this function. So I'll do get Pokemon down here. And now when I run my index.js, I should be able to get some information from the PokeAPI. Now there's a terminal right here, which you could run right on the glitch editor. Because I have limited screen space to work with on this tutorial, I'm going to be doing it in their full page little terminal here. And I'm going to run node index.js and see what happens. And here you can see we actually got a response from the PokeAPI. Now, there's a lot of information in this response, so it's not super useful to us right now, but it is good to just see that all you need to get information from an API is this bit of code and then making sure you've brought in that Axios package. And Axios isn't the only way to get information from an API. There's like a stock HTTP module in Node. There's all kinds of stuff, but Axios is easy and free. But if we come down here, we can see we have things like name Bulbasaur, we have order 1, we have species Bulbasaur, and I've actually found out that the species name is more useful than the plain Jane name right here. We have all kinds of sprites here. So what we can start doing is instead of just logging the entire response, which is stored in this poke variable here, we can start to actually get some of the information from this response and add it to different variables. So the first one I want to create, I'm going to call it const, let's call it name. And I'm going to set that equal to poke.name. And let's see what happens if I console log just the name. So this will autosave. I can come over here and I can type clear to clear out my terminal. And then I can hit up to find my past commands. And it looks like we have an undefined error. So this is something you're going to find yourself doing quite a lot when you start coding and building with APIs. You're going to want to go back to the API documentation and see what the problem is. Well, I have, let's see here. Do I have name as an actual value inside of this endpoint? I do. So I need to figure out why I'm not actually getting the name itself. So one more time, let's go ahead and log poke and see what the issue might be here. So if we look at the response, we can see that data is the object that contains all of these other objects and properties. So of the entire response, which we have put into the poke variable, we need to first specify that we want to access the data object and then the name object. So I will now modify this to be poke.data.name. And now if I log name, clear again, I get Bulbasaur. Look at that. So what we could do is just start defining a bunch of variables like HP, and we could just go on down the line and store all of these pieces of data from our API response in a specific variable. But instead of doing that, I want to define what's called an object. And that object is going to hold key value pairs, which are going to be a lot more, I guess, easier to work with. So I'm going to call this const pokeData. This is yet another variable, but it's going to be equal to an object. And to start defining that object, I'll use the curly braces here. And now I can actually start creating keys inside of this object, or properties, which are going to be key and value pairs. So there I can do name, and it's going to be in quotations with a colon there. I'm going to hit comma, and I'm going to start filling in these actual variables later on. First, I just want to actually define everything that we want here. So I'll do name, let's do number to make things clear. Let's do HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, special K, speed. For now, let's just do these stats, and we'll add height and weight as well. So I'll go up in here, add them like that. Okay, so now we need to figure out how to access each of these pieces of data within our response from the PokeAPI. So once again, let's go back to our handy dandy documentation, and we know that to access the name, which I'll zoom in even more if I can here. Woo! There we go. We know that to access, I think to the top, the name property, we need to go poke.data.name. So using that pattern, we know how to access basically anything else. For instance, if I come to species and I want the name from species, I would want to do poke.data.species.name. So let's go ahead and actually change up our variable here. So we're going to go poke.data.species.name. And then we can kind of go on down the line using this as our reference to get everything that we want. So ID is going to be the Pokemon's number. So that'll be poke.data.id. And then to find our height and weight, I believe those were actually just sitting there. Yep, height and weight. And then for HP, looking back at the documentation, we can see that we have a stats array here. And an array is essentially an ordered list of objects or values or variables. And in the documentation, it's only giving us one of those array elements, and that is the one for speed. But I know that there are more than that. So I'm going to go back to the PokeAPI homepage here. I'm going to pass Pokemon/1 as an example. And let's actually look at the resource for Bulbasaur here. So we'll come down, we'll find the little stats array. And yeah, we can see that there are actually 6 items in the stats array, with HP being the first one, attack being the second, defense, special attack, speed. And I want to make sure that that actually holds true for other Pokemon. So I'm going to go ahead and throw, let's just say 685 in there, Slurpuff. And let's make sure that the order is the exact same. So we've got HP, attack, defense, special defense, and speed. Cool. So we know that the order of these stats is the same for every Pokemon, which means we won't have to do anything fancy like digging into these arrays of objects and searching for key and value pairs. We have to do that later. So don't you worry if that was something you wanted to get into, because we will be getting into it. But for now, we can actually just call our array indices. So for HP, I know that's the first one. So we'll go poke.data.stats. And then to call a specific array element, we'll use a bracket here, and we'll put the actual index of that array. And then looking back one more time, we know that the actual HP is base stat. So if we add dot base stat, then that should be correct. So now all we need to do is copy this piece right here and paste it into all the other stats that are inside of that stats array. So I'll paste there, there, there. And now I want to make sure that I edit my array indexes for each of these to make sure that they go in the correct order. And I do remember it was HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. Arrays use zero-based indexing, if you're not familiar with them, which means that we have 6 different stats, but the first one starts at 0, so our final one stops at 5. So now we have an object called pokeData that should have all these different stats inside of it. And to double check, we can now console.log pokeData. Go back over to our console here, clear our previous commands, and look at that. We've got our name, we've got a number, and all of these useful stats. So now that we have a little bit of data from the PokeAPI, let's actually try to send that to Notion and see what happens. And from there, we can start to refine and build our loops and make things actually automated and go through the entire Pokedex. But for now, we're just gonna send this little old Bulbasaur to Notion. And to start that process off, I actually wanna come back up here to the top and start using this PokeArray variable. You will notice that this has been defined in what's called the global context. Essentially, I've not defined this variable inside of a function, which means any other function that we create is going to be able to access this variable. So that's not very useful right now because the array is empty and my PokeData is basically locked inside of this function. But what I can do is push this object onto our PokeArray here. So I'm going to do that by coming down here and typing PokeArray.push, which is the method for pushing objects or values onto the end of an array. And I'm going to pass in PokeData as my value there. So now when I run this, we're going to get all the information from PokeAPI. We're going to construct our object, and then we're going to push that object onto the end of PokeArray. And because PokeArray is empty, it's going to be the only element inside of it. The next thing we want to do is come down here and define our Notion function. So once again, I'm going to make this an async function, and I'm going to call it createNotionPage. We'll take in no arguments. And within this, I want to start out by creating what's called a for of loop. And this is basically a looping construct that is going to take an array and then do something to every single element of that array. And that's going to be very useful later when our PokeArray starts growing to potentially 905 Pokemon. So to do that, I will type for, and we'll do let Pokemon of PokeArray. So essentially this is defining a brand new variable, and each time this loop runs, its value is going to be set to whatever the next index of this array is. So right now it's just going to be basically given the value of PokeData up here, since we're only going to have that one element inside of PokeArray. So within that, we want to actually start creating an object that Notion is going to be able to interface with. And that is going to be our introduction to the Notion API itself. Now, maybe you've watched my no-code tutorials on how to interact with the Notion API without coding. Here, we actually have to learn how to interface with it and how to basically structure our data in the way that they need it to be in. So to do that, you're going to go over to developers.notion.com, and this is going to become your best friend as you go through this wonderful adventure of building applications that interface with Notion. And there are guides up here. There are even example projects which live on Glitch. So you can study these. That's actually how I found out about Glitch. I looked at this live example here. But the main useful thing that you're going to find here is the API reference right here. And this is essentially the Bible for the Notion API, and it shows you how everything is supposed to be structured when you send data to Notion. So the piece of information that we are most interested in right now is this create a page right here option underneath the page's subheading. And this will kind of show us how Notion actually wants its data to be structured. And we can look right here in this little Notion SDK for JavaScript and kind of get an example of what we need to build inside of our own application. In fact, you can basically just copy this if you want to, but I think it's going to be better if you actually build these things yourself and see how they work. But we can see here that we want to define a variable, and I'll try to zoom in more if I can. There we go. We want to define a variable called response, and this is going to hold a response from Notion once we create our page. And then we're going to actually use this notion.pages.create method to create a new page inside of our Notion workspace. And then we can basically pass it all the data that it wants, including this little parent value here. And this is going to specify the database in which the page is going to be created. So I'll zoom back out a little bit here so we can see things a bit more clearly. And this is kind of be our reference for actually building our function over in Glitch. So inside of our little for loop, we're going to define const response equals await. And we're using await here because once again, the Notion API may not instantly return the response that we want. So we want to make sure the rest of our code is waiting for this to finish. So going back over here to, once again, reference what we're supposed to do, we want to call notion.pages.create, and we're going to pass it an object. So notion.pages.create. And inside of this object, we're going to be defining more key and value pairs. So the most important one that we need to define right now is going to be our parent. And parent is going to be an object. If we go back, once again, you're just going to be referencing this all day long. It's going to be an object with type database ID and then database ID passing the actual value here. Type will be database ID, database ID. And here we can actually bring in our .env value here. So instead of actually typing that database ID that we copied to our clipboard earlier, we've already defined it in the .env file, which means that we can simply type process.env.notion database ID as our database ID, and we are good to go there. So the next thing that we want to define are our properties. And just so we're all speaking the exact same language here, our properties are going to be all of these little, again, key and value pairs that we see inside of Notion. So we want to be able to set our HP, attack, defense, all that good stuff. So to do that, we're going to create a properties object here. And once again, take a gander at how that is structured. Now, every different property type has a different way in which it is structured. And to see how they're all structured, underneath page object here in the sidebar, you can go to this property values option. You'll notice that there are two different options here, property values and property item object. Hey there, Future Tom here, once again interrupting this tutorial very briefly to give you an update on something that has changed since I recorded it. The Notion API documentation now only has one page underneath this page object dropdown here. Now you're gonna see in a couple of seconds in the original recording that there were two different options. I believe it was page property values and page property object. They have since consolidated everything into one page property value page here. So I'm going to leave the explanation of why there were two in the video. Otherwise, things are not going to make sense. But just know going forward, everything that I talk about on that page reference is going to be here in page property values. Once again, check that pinned comment down below. If there are any other changes or updates that I need to let you know about, I can't change them in the video itself, but I will be able to let you know about them in that pinned comment. So because we're trying to send information to Notion, we want to go over to property values, and we're going to start looking at the relevant properties that we need to actually work with given the data that we're using. So remind yourself very quickly while I drink this coffee of the data that we have specified that we want to work with. One more time, we'll go back to it. We have a name, that's going to be text property or the title property. We've got number, that'll be a number. We've got HP, height, weight, attack. All of these are actually going to be simple number properties. And I wanted to start with those because they're very, very simple. So if we go to our property values here, we've got a handy dandy little table of contents, and we can click on title and see exactly how title is structured here. And you'll notice that title and also simple rich text property values are kind of complicated. So I would invite you to just basically pause the video for a second, or maybe go over to the reference yourself and study what is exactly happening here. I'll zoom in so we can go through it. We are actually defining the name of the property right here, and it corresponds to an object where we have title, and that's an array of objects itself, and these are text objects. So kind of study this, and as you use this more and more in your code, you're going to get really good at basically bringing this up from memory. But at first, it can be kind of hard to work with. So I may have to actually refer back to this one more time. But I'm going to come down here, and our first property is going to be, let's reference and make sure that our name property is indeed name. So I'll go to a table view, and it is name. Cool. So it's going to be name. And name is going to contain an object with the title array. And looking back here, because it's hard to keep in memory, that array contains objects where it's type text, and then text is an object itself. Cool. So create ourselves an object with a type property and then a text object. And within our content property here, we want to pass what? We want to pass our variable, which is going to be, if you look up here, pokedata.name, except it's not pokedata.name because we're using this for of loop here. We're taking each element from pokeArray, which is that entire object. Pokedata was just the definition of that object, and we're putting it into Pokemon. So we'll come down here, we'll do Pokemon.name. Remember, to access individual properties of an object, all you need to do is call the object name. Again, that is Pokemon, and then the property itself. So Pokemon.data in this case. And now let's go ahead and set up our number properties. So I'll add a comma here. We want to always separate sequential objects with commas, otherwise we're going to get a syntax error. And we'll go back over to our handy dandy Notion documentation. I will zoom out a couple of times to get our table of contents back, and we'll look at the number property values here. Numbers are way, way, way easier. All you need to do is create an object that contains the name of the property, and then that is an object with number and the number value. Very, very easy. So I'm going to do one of these expanded like this, and then we're going to see how you can actually compress it. So the first one is going to be, let's put a comma at the end of name object and bring in no. So that should allow us to add number here. And then the value of number is going to be Pokemon dot, let's reference our keys here, dot number. So Pokemon dot number. And now we can do basically the same thing for all of our other values here. So if we want to do HP, now instead of hitting enter, I can actually just create my object in here. We don't have to use new lines. So I'll do Pokemon.HP for that one. And to save myself a bit of effort, I will copy this and paste it a few more times. Oops. Remembering to put commas each time. And I'll change these as needed. Now, once again, I will note that these key values here, because this is what we're actually sending to Notion, these must correspond to the actual property names as they are spelled. So now I'm coming on to the special attack property. And if we go up to our Pokedata object definition, you can notice here that there is a dash between special and attack and the special and defense. To actually reference this property here, we have to use what's called bracket notation. When objects or properties have just a single word as their key, or if it's multiple words with underscores, we can use this dot notation here. We just go like Pokemon.name. But if it has multiple words or it has dashes, we cannot do that. We actually have to do bracket, and then we have to actually spell it out like so instead. So we'll do the exact same thing for special defense here. And then I will finish out all of our other numbers. Cool. So now we have all of our properties, our number properties defined. We've got our name defined, and we've defined this directly in this await Notion pages.create. So this should, once we actually call this function here, actually send a new page to Notion. Now, to do that, we have to actually invoke this function here. And I could do it at the bottom of our script here, but if I do that, it's not actually going to get any information to send to Notion, because once again, we're using an asynchronous promised-based function to get all this information from the PokeAPI. So we actually want to call our createNotionPage function within this function. So after this catch block here, and after this whole await Axios call, I want to make sure I'm doing it within this function. So after here, I will simply call createNotionPage. And because we already have Bulbasaur as our first little reference Pokemon, let's actually change the number in this API call to 2. So we grab Ivysaur. And to see what's actually happening, I do want to add a little bit of logging to our script here. So instead of console logging Pokedata, why don't we put console logging fetching? And this is what's called a template literal. So it's basically defining a string with these backtick characters, and that will actually allow me to call variables and write code inside of the string itself. And I can do that with a $sign and then a curly brace pair. So I'm going to say fetching pokedata.name from PokeAPI. So we'll log that when it actually runs the call. And then let's add a couple of more here. So let's add a log right before this, console.log, sending data to Notion. And finally, after this, let's log the response. And now we should actually be able to get information from this whole process inside of the terminal. So let's go back over to our terminal. Let's make sure it's clear, and then let's run index.js and see what happens. All right, so looking at our logs here, it says fetching Ivysaur from Pokemon API, awesome, sending data to Notion, and then we actually got a response from Notion, and we can see that it was successful because we have a brand new page ID. So let's go back over to Notion and see if we can find our newly created Pokemon. And that's weird, it's not actually showing underneath Bulbasaur. And I think the reason there is that we did not define the generation that we are setting for that Pokemon, and we are currently not displaying any Pokemon that don't have a generation property set. So I need to come in here and go into my grouping and show no generation. I'll drag that up to the top, and let's see if we get anything there. There it is, Ivysaur. And we don't have any picture data, but we do have the number. We have our HP, attack, defense, and all these stats. And then we have a few different formulas that are using these stats to translate them into meters, kilograms, all that kind of good stuff. Which means we now have our first API created page inside of our Notion Pokedex. If you followed me so far, pat yourself on the back because you just used JavaScript code to create something in Notion. And hopefully it feels just as good for you as it felt for me when I figured this out for the first time. So, at this point, all we need to do is take our little MVP here and start basically fleshing it out. So we want to start adding some of those images in here. We want to basically format the name so it's capitalized. We want to add our category text, our types, all that kind of good stuff. But the first thing I want to do before we start fleshing that out is get more than one Pokemon from the PokeAPI and deliver multiple pages to Notion at once. And if you have been following along so far, you will know that our code is almost already set up to do this because inside of our createNotionPage array here, we have set up our little for of loop. So as long as the array that we're working with, this poke array, has more than one element, then this is going to be executed for all of the elements, which means all we need to do is pack this array with more than just one Pokemon. And how are we going to do that? Well, of course, we're going to use another loop inside of our get Pokemon function. So I'm going to enter down from here, and for this part, I want to use an old school for loop where we're actually going to define how many times we'll loop through directly in the declaration for the loop. So I'm going to do for let I equal 0. Actually, I think it's going to equal 1 to start because we want to actually go by the numbers in this URL. We are going to say I is less than, and let's say less than 10 or less than equal to 10. So we're going to pull 10 different Pokemon. And then I is going to increment by 1 each time the loop successfully runs. So we'll create a little curly brace pair there. And now I want to go grab this entire function that we've created. And I want to cut it and I want to paste it inside of our loop. So now we're going to be running this bad boy every single time we go through the loop, but for a new Pokemon. I'm going to tab that in just for a bit more readability. And now we want to adjust the API URL that we are calling. And just as a side note here, when working with APIs, you may have seen that there are many different commands you can use, such as get and post and put and all kinds of other ones, patch, delete. Well, here we can see that we are using the get command here, which is pulling information from this resource. But this is no good because we're going to go through this loop 10 different times, and every single time we would be pulling the information for Ivysaur. So instead of a statically coded URL here, we're going to turn this into a template literal by changing those single quotes into backticks, and that will allow us to pass the value of I in our URL. So now, if the value of I is 1, we're going to be calling /Pokemon/1, which is Bulbasaur. If it's, say, 657, it's going to be 657 here, and whichever Pokemon is there is going to be pulled as well. And that's basically all we need to do to get the loop working. So we already have Ivysaur and we already have Bulbasaur. Let's go ahead and set I to 3. So the first one it pulls is Venusaur, and we'll go back and run our script one more time. So arrow up, node index.js. And when I hit this, I should get fetching information for, I believe it's 8 different Pokemon here. So let's try it. There it is, there it is. And we're getting logs for all of these brand new created Notion pages. If I scroll all the way back up, we can see we fetched all of these different Pokemon from the PokeAPI, and then we sent data to Notion for all of them. So going back over to our handy little Notion workspace, we can see that we now have a nice shiny entry for all of these different Pokemon. We are now making our way through this process. At this point, all we really need to do is start massaging the data to make it look the way we want and adding a few more pieces of information like our category, our type, our generation, all that kind of good stuff. But hopefully now you're seeing how you can actually call an API multiple times using a loop to get multiple pieces of information, store that in a temporary holding place, the array that we're building, and then use another loop to send those pieces of information one by one to another API, in this case, the Notion API. So at this point, it's going to be a process of refinement, and we're going to start using some more advanced code to do some interesting things like manipulating strings and capitalizing things and all kinds of good stuff like that. So this is going to be a bit more of an advanced section of the tutorial. And once again, you can, as always, look through the code and study it for yourself. One nice thing to know is, now that we've basically set up our call to the Notion API, and this is just all of my code and VS Code as a reference, it's not going to be a whole lot more complicated to add more blocks and more properties to our call to Notion. That part is actually pretty easy. What's going to be a bit more complicated is doing things like removing new lines from data that we get, basically massaging data to make it look the way that we want. And sometimes we're going to be using multiple different functions in sequence to do that. So if the first part of this tutorial was 101, this is now 102 or 201, or however colleges like to use their naming conventions. I haven't been to college in a long time. I'm kind of ancient at this point, and that's okay. I just wipe away the tears every day. The existential dread is at bay for now. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is start getting some more data from our Pokemon endpoint, because we got our name, we got our number, we got our HP. Let's see what else we can get from that particular endpoint. And of particular interest to me is going to be our sprites here. If I actually grab, let's just take this, actually, I want to come down here to the official artwork. If I grab this URL and I go to it in my browser, we can see that we get the official artwork for this Pokemon. And we actually want to bring that into our Notion Pokedex. So let's learn how to actually access that, again, from the PokeAPI. Well, once again, we know that all this is contained within an object called data. So we're going to go data.sprites.other.officialartwork.frontDefault. That is a mouthful, but we are going to push through and figure it all out. So remember that the call to the PokeAPI through Axios.get was basically stored in this little poke variable here, which allows us to use that as the base object and then access the inner objects just like this. So once again, we're going to add ourselves a brand new property here, and we're going to call it sprite. And that is going to be poke.data.sprites. And I actually want to get 2 different sprites from here. I want to get the default sprite, which is the more pixelated one, and I'm going to set that as my little icon. And then I want to get the official artwork as well. So this one's a bit easier to do. So I'm going to copy this value right here, sprites front default. And notice that we have an underscore here, and underscores are totally fair game when it comes to dot notation, which means I can come over here and simply call it just like that. And then I'm going to do one more called artwork. And for that one, we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to go to data.sprites.other, and let's reference it one more time. Other, official dash artwork, and then front default. So for official dash artwork, we're going to have to use bracket notation. Going back here, so let's get rid of that dot. Let's do official dash artwork dot front default. So let's go back to the actual project here. Look at our object definition here and see if there's anything else that we are missing. And I can see a couple of different things that we are. We're missing this bulb URL property here. That's going to get our Bulbapedia URL. We are missing the types. And then our name has been changed to a variable here called processed name. If we come back up here, we can see that process name is quite a mouthful. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. And another interesting thing is we can see that our sprite property here is calling a variable called sprite. The reason that we have to do that, and I think we'll start there, is there are, I believe, 6 new Pokemon that were introduced in Legends Arceus or Arceus. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but they don't have actual sprites. They are like 3D renders only in that game. There are no sprite data, and that is going to be a problem for us because if we're trying to call that specific sprite property there, for those Pokemon, we're not going to get it, and we're going to get an error in our code. So let's go ahead and create this little bit here in our code. And this is going to be a conditional statement, which basically is like an if-then statement. So let's go ahead and say const sprite equals, and to define what is inside this variable, we're going to create a conditional statement using what's called ternary syntax. And that is basically using what's called the ternary operator. If you want to learn about it in my Notion formula documentation inside of the if page under operators, there's a whole bit about how it works under, I think it's like shorthand syntax. And this basically explains what is happening. So check that out if you are curious, but I'm just going to go with the bang here. And I believe it's going to be poke.data sprites. Yep. .front default. And because I'm putting the bang operator here, basically if the value of this property here is null, which means it doesn't exist, that essentially means it is falsy in a Boolean sense, like a true false sense. And if it is falsy, then the value of sprite is instead going to be our official artwork. So the then condition comes after the question mark, the first part of the ternary operator, and the else condition will come after a colon, and that's going to be the actual sprite's front default value. Which means that for those very new Pokemon that don't have a sprite's front default, they're just going to have their sprite value set to their official artwork, and everything else is going to get a nice, cool pixelated sprite. Then we can come down here to sprite, and we can change this to our sprite variable there, and we can move on to the next thing, which is going to be our types array. So we want to get the types of each Pokemon, and I'm going to set this to a variable that I'm going to call types array. So we need to actually create that up here. And the reason we have to do this is if we go into the Notion documentation, zoom out to get my table of contents back, and we look at multi-select property values, zooming back in for easiness, we can see here that to send multi-select data to a Notion database, we first define the name of the property, and then we pass in an array that contains all the different multi-select options we want to set. And Pokemon can have either 1 or 2 types. We don't know until we get the actual data from the PokeAPI, so we need to dynamically create our multi-select array with each type for each Pokemon. So to do that, let's go ahead and create ourselves an array. I'm going to call this const types array, and that is going to be set to an empty array at first. Then we're going to get ourselves yet another handy dandy for loop. So it's going to be for, and we'll go let type of, and we need to figure out what is the array that we're going to be looping over here for this loop. Well, let's go back to the PokeAPI and let's take a look at the types array right here. So it's going to be data.types. So if we come back here, it's going to be let type of poke.data.types. In here, we can actually create an object. So let's just do const type obj. I'll do type obj, that's fine. And it needs to basically be in the format that it's going to expect here. So type obj is going to be essentially this value right here, which means all it needs is a key and value pair. So it's going to be name. And remember, it has to be name. And then the value is going to be type, because again, we are taking the value of this array at the specific index and bringing it in there. So it'll be type, and let's look at our documentation once again. So type dot type, because this is the object inside of the array index that we want to access, dot name. So type dot name. And then to finish this up, we will push this type object onto the types array. So we'll do types array dot push, and we'll pass type object or type obj. So this will loop through this array, which is again returned by our API. It will create an object for each type that it finds in that array. And then we're going to push that onto our own custom array, which again is formatted the way that Notion wants. And then we take types array and we pass that as the value of the types property in PokeData. So we've got our types, and let's look once more at my example project to see what else we need. Lastly, we need our bulb URL, and we need our processed name. So let's take a quick look at bulb URL, and we can see here that we are essentially defining a variable that contains the normal Bulbapedia website URL here with /wiki, and then we are taking the processed name and running it through a replace function, and finally ending with underscore Pokemon. So let's take a look at why we need to do it that way. And I'm just simply going to Google Bulbapedia. So if we look at the Charizard URL here, and I'll bring it up on Notepad, we can see that, well, this is formatting itself very weird. It's not actually like that in the Chrome address bar. But we can see that we basically have a template here. The name of the Pokemon, underscore, and then Pokemon. If I search for Bulbasaur, then we're going to get the same old story. Which means that if we can get a name formatted just like this, then we can dynamically generate a link to basically any Bulbapedia link for any Pokemon, all 905 in fact. So to do that, let's first create our little bulb URL property here. That's going to be quite easy. And then we're going to create our processed name variable, which as you can see here is quite a bit tougher to build and has a lot of edge cases that we have to deal with. So let's create this really quickly. I'm going to grab this value here, but I will actually type out the rest just to explain what I'm doing. So once more, let's just do it beneath sprite. We'll do const bulb URL equals template literal. Here's our base of our URL. And then we're going to pass in the value of a variable, which is as of yet undefined, but it will be in a couple of seconds. Processed name underscore, and we'll come back over here so I don't have to figure out how to type accents on my keyboard. It's way harder than it needs to be on Windows. So now all we need to do is figure out what process name is going to be. But first, let's come down here and actually define this. So we'll create one more key value pair. I'm going to call it bulb URL, and it'll be set to bulb URL. So that is going to be ready to go once we have our processed name variable set. So let's go ahead and do that. This is going to be probably the most technical part of the tutorial. So let's define a processed name variable, and then let's explain exactly what is happening and why we need it to happen. So you can see that we are taking that pokedata species name and we're running it through a whole bunch of functions here. And if you are not used to this sort of verbose and compressed JavaScript code, you would usually see one function being called and then the result of that being thrown into a variable, and then we'd call another function on that variable. But one cool thing about JavaScript is you can basically just chain a whole bunch of functions, and the return value of a split is just going to get fed into this map function, which is going to get fed into this join function, and so on and so on and so on. You can just chain these together all day long, which is pretty cool. So what we need to do is take the name that the PokeAPI gives us, which if we look here under species name, and capitalize it and then deal with any punctuation spaces, that kind of thing. Let me pull another Pokemon as an example here. Let's see here. I think it's Mr. Mime with a dash. Yep. We can see here that our species name property is Mr-Mime, which is no good because we want Mr. capitalized with a period, space, Mime capitalized with a period. And if we look for Mr. Mime on Bulbapedia, we can see that it's written exactly like that. And even in the URL, bringing back my notepad here, we've got Mr._Mime_. So we have some text processing to do here, and we're going to do it all in one big batch of calls under processed name. Let me actually rename the processed name don't want to typo myself there. So first, let's actually get the name value. We can just copy that from name and go like that. And then we want to first split it. So let's walk through this step by step. This is very, very complex looking, but I guarantee you if we walk through it step by step and you stay with me, you are going to understand what is happening. So if I go to split here and I add that on there, I'll just copy it. This function is going to essentially split this string into an array of smaller strings, and it's going to look for the dash as the character it will split on. If I wanted to actually save the dash as well, I could put the dash in parentheses, but I don't actually want to do it. This is also where I'm going to introduce a very useful resource that you're always going to want to have in your back pocket. And that's going to be the MDN, or Mozilla Developer Network Web Docs for JavaScript. Usually these are in dark mode. This is terrible. What's going on here? Much, much better. Okay. Basically any method in JavaScript, there is full and comprehensive technical documentation on MDN for it. So if I want to know how split works, I will look for split and I can see string.prototype.split. That is the exact method that I want to look at here. And we can see it takes a pattern and divides a string into an ordered list of substrings, which will be an array, by searching for the pattern and then putting the substrings into an array. And we can see a try it area here. We have syntax. We even have examples down here. So there's all kinds of very, very useful reference information on MDN. Highly recommend bookmarking this resource if you're going to be doing this kind of development in the future. So what I'm passing in my split here is what's called a regular expression. And I define that by these two forward slashes, and then I can put my expression inside of there. I am not going to go super into regular expressions in this video, but I will note that number one, MDN has a great resource on regular expressions. I believe it's under regexp. Yep. So all kinds of good stuff there. Also, regular expressions are very handy in Notion formulas. So over on my Notion formula reference, which I will have linked down below, I've got a whole regular expressions in Notion formulas reference guide here, and this shows all the regular expressions that you can use inside of Notion. And I have found that playing around with regular expressions in Notion formulas is kind of like a great little sandbox playground for understanding how to use them in JavaScript. And it's been kind of cool to have spent months hammering away at Notion problems where my only tool was crazy regex usage because we don't have things like arrays and functions. And then to get into this kind of stuff with JavaScript and realize, oh, I know regular expressions and I can kind of actually use them. So use them and try them out in your Notion formulas and then try them out in your JavaScript code as well. So basically, and we can actually log this to show you what's going to happen, is we're going to split this into an array. So why don't we do this? Let's do console.log process name. And this is a great way to learn how to code actually. Just simply logging things as you build them and then adding a little bit of complexity and then logging that. And let's go ahead and comment out the createNotionPage here. We don't actually want that. And now let's go ahead and run this one more time. So processed name, we're splitting it. What we should get from this is an array of values where we find a dash character. And I know already that we are calling several different Pokemon that are not going to meet the criteria here because they all have one word in their name. So let's make sure that Mr. Mime is in our original group here. 122 is his number. We'll go over here and we're going to set this at 120 and we'll set the end at 130. So coming back down here, we're going to log our process name. And what we should get is an array with one value for everything except for Mr. Mime's entry, which should have two values. Let's go over here once again, clear this, run it, and see what happens. All right, we have type error here. Cannot read property front default of undefined. What's going on there? Go back to the code and, oh, I can see that I forgot to put data in front of sprites there and front default and there as well. So hopefully that gets rid of our errors there. Let's clear once again. Fetching star U, and here we go. Now we're getting arrays. Remember, process name is a variable that is getting the value returned by the split function, which always returns an array. So we get an array with one element for each of these except for Mr. Mime's because we split Mr. Mime's string on the presence of that dash character. So that is our first little call here, the split function. The next one is a bit more complicated. We're going to use the map function to make sure that every word in a Pokemon's name is capitalized on the first letter. So Mr. Mime, right? Bulbasaur, the Gabagool.
Where's the freaking Gabagool?
I wish there was a Pokemon named Gabagool. Okay, so coming back here, we'll paste this in. We'll make sure we have a dot. And once again, we're going to go over to handy dandy MDN to see exactly what the heck we are doing here. So back over to MDN, we're going to search for map, and we are using array prototype map. So we can see here the map method creates a new array populated with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. And this is actually a really good way to explain it here with the demo they have here. So we are calling map on array 1, which just has some numbers. Every element is a simple number. And the function that we are going to apply to every element of this array, one by one, is we're going to take that element and assign it to x, and then multiply x by 2. And then we're going to get a brand new array that has the value of running that element through the function. So here we have 2, 8, 18, 32, which is double of each one here. So going back to our code, what the heck are we doing with our instance of map here? Well, we are mapping each element returned by split, and we're putting it into the value of name. So if we have Mr. and Mime, the first time map runs on the first element of the returned array, it's going to be on Mr. So name's value will be Mr. And we are returning this right here. And what exactly is this? Well, when we do name and then we pass an index like this on a string, and remember this name is a string right now, it's just the string of Mr., we can access specific characters in that string. So we are accessing the first character, which will be the M, and we're passing it to the toUpperCase function, which just makes it uppercase. And then we are concatenating it, basically adding it on to a substring. And the substring function, once again, we can go back to our MDN substring, takes in a string and returns the part of it between the start and end indexes, or to the end of the string if we only pass one. So we can see here, we are passing in Mozilla. If we go string or str, which is this variable here, dot substring 2, we get Zilla because we're going 0, 1, 2, returning that to the end because we did not provide an end index there. So the logic here is we want to capture that first character in the string, the M in Mr., and capitalize it, and then return the rest of the string and mash those two things together. So now map is going to return a brand new array which contains capitalized Mr., capitalized Mime. But that is an array still, and we want a string to end this up. So going back, what are we passing this into? We're passing this into a function called join. So I can now copy this part, add that bad boy on there, and let's take a look at what's going on here. Join, and we are passing that a simple space. So handy dandy MDN, go back to the join method right here, and we can see join method creates and returns a new string by concatenating all of the elements in an array separated by commas or by the specified separator string. This is the important bit here, because if I just passed in something like this, fire, air, water, with just join and no separator string, I would just get a comma separated list like that. I don't want that. I want a space. So I want to pass a space as my separator character. So let's go ahead and log process name one more time now that we've added all of this stuff on here. I'll clear this again. Run node. And where's Mr. Mime? Boom, there he is right there. Mr. space Mime. That is almost what we want. So the last thing we need to do to finish up this process name variable that we're declaring here is to run it through a bunch of these replace calls. And I'm only going to explain it once, and then you can kind of get the gist of what's happening on all the other ones. So we're going to go back once again to handy dandy MDN, find that replace function, and we can see here the replace method returns a new string with one, some, or all matches of a pattern replaced by replacement. In plain English, we are going to be looking for some kind of pattern in a string, and when we find it, we're going to slice that out and we're going to replace it with something else. So if we look here at my first one in my code, I am passing dot replace. Let's actually put that in there, and I'm going to enter it onto its own new line just for readability. We're looking for the first instance of this pattern, Mr. space M, and I know there's only one Pokemon that has that pattern, and we're going to replace that substring with Mr. dot space M. So to finish this up, all I need to do is pass in the rest of my replace calls, and each one of these is handling another edge case. Mime Jr., Mr. Rhyme, I think Ho-Oh is in there. We've got Nidoran female and male with these sex symbols that are actually in the game files. We're replacing those with the actual symbols, and this gives us one big robust chain of method calls that make sure process name always gives us a good looking name. And then the last thing we need to do, because we are just passing process name right here, we want to make sure that we replace any space characters from process name with underscore characters when it is called in this bulb URL. So I'm going to do dot replace once again, and I'm going to look for any space like that, and I'm going to replace with an underscore. And to prove that it worked, let's go ahead and log it. Go back to our console, clear, and run it one more time. Cool. Bulbapedia, Jinx underscore Pokemon. Where is Mr. Mime? Mr.Mime Pokemon. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. So we are good with all of our processing now. We can make sure that we are calling bulb URL down here. And now we also want to make sure that instead of poke.data.species.name, we call the new variable that we just spent so much time working on so we can actually use it. So now that we have made our PokeData object a bit more robust, why don't we actually pass this information to Notion? That'll be the next kind of step in this process. Well, let's come down here, and now we want to start just defining the properties that we are going to be working on here. So the first thing that I'm going to focus on is types right here. And this should be pretty easy, but we can come back over to our property values area in the Notion API. Zoom out so I get my nice little table of contents. And once again, let's look at multi-select property values and see how we are supposed to get this formatted. Here we go. So we're going to call the name of the property. We're going to pass that an object containing a multi-select array. And that is actually just going to be our types array. So we can actually just do tags or whatever it's called, types array. So let's look at our Pokedex template here and see what this is called. It's type. So instead of tags, it would be type. Let's come up into our properties, or just down into our properties. And I guess I'll just put it after my number property here. So we'll do type, and that'll be an object. I'm actually gonna keep it on one line, add my trailing comma, and then I need to do I believe it's underscore select as the key. Let's double check that it's that. It is, it's that. And then again, the value of multi-select is the array. And just to give you one little reminder here, our types value is types array, which is already an array, which means all we need to do is type Pokemon.types right there. And that'll pass the array as the value of this multi-select property. Cool. So let's look at what else we have to pass. We have bulb URL. That's going to be some body content. We have sprite and we have artwork. And I believe that's everything that we are adding here. So we're going to save bulb URL for a little bit later. First, let's work with the sprite and the artwork. So what we want to do is set the artwork as the page cover, and then we want to set the sprite as the icon. Going back to our official decks here, or at least this reference piece here, we can see that the sprite has been set as the icon here, and then the official artwork has been set as the page cover. So let's start building that. We can come back down here, and I know that these things are defined outside of the properties object. They are their own objects. And to find out how to format them, we'll once again go over to our handy dandy API reference, and we're going to go over to the create a page reference page here. And if we look at this little black box right here, we can actually see how this is set up. So within the data object, we have cover, and that's its object, and then we have icon. And if we want to pass an external image for icon instead of emoji here, we'll do this exact same thing here with external, URL, etc. So first we'll do cover, and then we'll do icon. We can just kind of copy and paste from that point. I'll put this above properties. We'll call it cover. That'll be an object. I'll add my trailing comma there. And then the first thing is going to be type external. External is its own object containing a property called URL. And that is going to be, going back up for our artwork, artwork. So it should just be Pokemon.artwork. And now, because the icon is very similar, we can copy that, paste it, add our trailing comma once again. But in this case, we want to say icon. And instead of the icon being the official artwork, we want it to be the sprite. And remember, Pokemon.sprite corresponds to our object definition, which is being given a new variable name, Pokemon, because of the loop, but the property is sprite. So the next thing we'll do is add some children to this little page definition. And to do that, let's once again go back to this create page reference, and let's see if it gives us a hint on how to do it. So we have properties here. We'll keep scrolling down, and aha, here we go. Children is yet another property which contains an array of child blocks. And then we have a definition for each kind of block that we want to create. So let's get that going first. Children, we'll make sure that we put this after our properties definition. Yep, there we go. Call this children. And children is an array. And then the array is going to be filled with objects. So I know we'll already start with curly braces here. And when we want to add a block, it's always going to have this first property. It's going to be object block. And now to find the rest of the properties that we want to add in here, we could look at this, but what's going to be way more useful is to come into this block object page. And this is going to give us a definition for every kind of block that we're able to send to Notion via the API. So this is a paragraph block. Paragraph blocks can be very complicated because you can define all their formatting. You can define bolding, colors, all kinds of stuff. But we want to look at something a lot simpler to start with, which is going to be a bookmark block. So boom, there it is, bookmark. And all we need to do is specify the type is bookmark and then pass a bookmark object with the URL. That's pretty easy. So let's do object block, type bookmark. Bookmark, again, is an object itself with a property of URL. And the URL is, what is it? Well, we can come back up here to our object definition, and we can see it's bulb URL. So it'll be pokemon.bulbURL. So now we have reconfigured the object we're going to send to Notion for all the new data we've added. And I think we have everything we need to try another test run. So let's once again look at the group of Pokemon we're going to send. It's going to be 120 to 130. Why don't we actually set that back to 1 and 10. And inside of our Notion template, we'll go ahead and delete all of these records, even Bulbasaur. We don't need him for now. And before we run it, we want to come down here and uncomment our createNotionPage function call, because otherwise nothing will happen. And if we want to, we could also get rid of this console log for process name and for bulb URL. Those were just for testing. And once we're done testing, we can get those out of there to stop polluting our console when we run things. So let's go ahead and clear our console. And once again, node index.js and see what happens. So we're fetching, cool. And we've got new pages coming in the Notion. We can see their URLs right there. And if we go back over to Notion, look at that. We have got Pokemon, we have got art, we've got numbers, and we're missing just a few different things. So if we wanted to, we could set the sprite inside of this little sprite file attachment here. I've decided that it's a lot nicer just to use the page cover. But look, we've got the page cover set with the official art, when we have the icon as the sprite data, and we've got that for all of our Pokemon. And I think if we drag this little side peek over to be a little bit thinner, we can see more of it. I'm so zoomed in on this tutorial, I can't drag it in much more than this. But if you're not this zoomed in, you usually can. And if we come down, we have our Bulbapedia link, and let's test a couple to see if they work. So Charizard works perfectly. And let's test Wartortle as well. Coming on down, click that. Boom, Wartortle, perfect. So you will notice that we are missing a few pieces of information here. We're missing the category, which would be things like, I think it's like lizard Pokemon, flame Pokemon, things like that. We are missing the generation, and we are missing one thing that I do want to have, which is the flavor text for the Pokemon. Every Pokemon has flavor text. If I come into my actual dex here and scroll down, let's go to Butterfree. We have got, in battle, it flaps its wings at high speed to release highly toxic dust into the air. Well, joke's on you, Butterfree. I love highly toxic dust. I want to have this kind of stuff in my page as well. So how can I do that? Well, if we look back at the PokeAPI, we will notice that at the Pokemon resource, we don't have that information. And that is because there is another Pokemon resource called Pokemon-species. And if we call that one, we get an entirely different set of information. For instance, we get a property called genera. And if we look at genera, we can actually see, if I come down to the English one, barrier Pokemon. That is what is called the category on Bulbapedia, barrier Pokemon or dancing Pokemon. Going back to the Pokemon API, we also have flavor text in this response, flavor text entries right there. And there are quite a lot of them, many of them for different languages and different versions of the game. And finally, the generation is also inside of this Pokemon species endpoint. So that means that we have to call this endpoint and append the data that we get from it into the object we've already created per Pokemon. So how can we do that? Well, once again, we can utilize a handy dandy loop for ourselves. So after the first loop that we created right here, this for-let I, we're going to make ourselves a brand new loop. But this time we have an array to work with. Just like with the Notion call, we had PokeArray that's now populated with elements. We can use that once again to basically loop through and call this new API endpoint at PokeAPI using the ID or the number of the Pokemon that we are interested in. And we can do that for every Pokemon. So we're going to go for let Pokemon of PokeArray. Once again, we're going to be feeding the object defined here for each element in this array into this temporary variable, and that will allow us to work with it inside of these little curly brackets here. So we're going to make another call to Axios, or to the Pokemon API via Axios. Let's call this const flavor, maybe flavor town. Nah, just flavor for now. And once again, it's going to be await Axios.get. And what's the resource we're calling? It's Pokemon-species. So I'll just copy this right here, pass that in there, get rid of Mr. Mime. And we already know that we want to convert these single quotes to backticks to turn this into a template literal where we can pass our dynamic value here. And we can actually pass the number. If I go back to the PokeAPI, what was Mr. Mime, 122? Mr. Mime, there he is right there. Hopefully you knew that, Tony. 122, Mr. Mime. You may need that at some point in your life. So, template literal variable. We'll do a little dollar signs, our little curly braces, and that's going to be, what is it? Pokemon.number. Then once again, we'll do a dot then. We'll bring in our variable as flavor, do a little arrow function, and define what we're going to do with the response we get in here. So once again, this is an iterative development process. We are learning bit by bit as we go. And one piece of advice I can give you for development, no matter what you're doing, is just run it at all times. If you're ever confused, if you're like, I don't understand this, this is overwhelming, there's too much to do, just run it. And then you're going to get some feedback, and then you can make a little bit of a change, and you can run it again, and you'll do that again and again and again. And then one day you'll wake up and you'll go, wait, I know way more than I ever did before. So let's console log flavor. Let's comment out createNotionPage again, just to make sure we're not sending a bunch of bogus data to Notion. And let's run our index one more time. bunch of stuff. So we can tell that it is working, but once again, it is a huge amount of data that is not going to be that useful. So just as we did with our original call to that original Pokemon resource at PokeAPI, we're going to start defining down here, defining an object that gets pieces of the response and stores them. But we don't actually want to define a new object. We want to actually add to the previously defined object, this pokeData, because that way we're just going to be able to, once again, call down here Pokemon dot, let's just say genera or flavor text or whatever it is. So to do that, we are first going to define some variables. And to start that process, I'm going to make a const flavor town. It's too tempting, but I'm going to call it flavor text. And that is going to be flavor dot, and let's look back at our API response to see what it needs to be. We know that .data enwraps, or I guess encapsulates all of this. So it's going to be .data, flavor text entries, and then we are going to need to find the particular flavor text entry that we want, which is going to be the one in English, at least for my purposes, because I only speak English and I guess JavaScript now. So we're going to have to do something kind of fancy here, because we could be lazy and we could be like, oh, well, this is right here at array index 0. So we could just do flavor text entries. Going back, we could do .data.flavor text entries 0 dot flavor text. And that would give us the flavor text in this particular instance. But if you look at some other Pokemon, you will find that their 0 index is in Korean or Japanese. If I come up here and let's just do 780. Now, if I go to the flavor text, the first array indice here is actually in Japanese. So that is not going to work for our purposes. Instead, we need to do what is maybe the most technical part of this tutorial. But again, when we just simply break things down and we take a little bit of time to study them, it's not that crazy to learn how they work. We need to do something called nested object destructuring, because we need to search inside of the objects contained within this array for a particular value. And then using that search result, we want to return a different value. Essentially, what we want to do is look inside this flavor text entries array, find the one that has this nested name value of, I believe there's going to be EN somewhere. So we have to go way down to find it in this case. Yeah, it's 7, EN. And then we want to get the flavor text value from that object in the array. So let's go ahead and find that bit of code. Here it is in my original code here. So you can see, once again, we are actually passing it through multiple different functions. First, we're doing .find, and then we're passing that result and the flavor text property of that result into another instance of replace. So let's first grab just this piece and we'll bring it over. So we want to call this on the array itself. And let's first look at the dot or the find method in MDN. So find, and we can see the find method returns the first element in the provided array that satisfies the provided testing function. So essentially we're going to go through the entire array and we're going to define a piece of search criteria, which is a function. Here, we're looking for the first array element that is greater than 10. So go, nope, not 5, 12. Yep, we're going to return 12. And this is actually very useful because we are returning the entire array element, even if we are going to look deeper into this array to do our search function here. So to do that, we have to do something called nested object destructuring. And that is basically this little bit of nastiness right here. So instead of passing the entire array element into the function, maybe we could actually do that, but we're going to do it this way because it's fancier. We are going to dig into that array and we're going to get this name property, which is itself a property of the nested language object. So I could switch this up and I could just use name right here. And name would hold the entire array element for each one in the array. So going back here, that would be all of this junk. But I actually just want to grab this. So to do that, I can use what's called object destructuring. And that is where we dig into the object and we get the value of one of its properties. So in that case, I could just do language here, and that would get the entirety of this language object here, but I just want this name and I want to look for en. So we can take our destructured object and we can do nested object destructuring. Once again, it's the same as before. Reviewing here, we are reaching in to each element of the array, 7, 6, 5, all of them. We're reaching into the language object inside that array element, and we're grabbing this name property. And then it is now in this name variable. We're going to check that it's equal, strictly equal to en. So it's going to return the first entire array element that satisfies this test. And then we're going to access the flavor text property of that element. Going back to the API, we have our array elements, and then we have the flavor text property inside of it. So we want that, but if we log that as it is, and let's go ahead and do that as a test. So we're good to go there. Console.log flavor text. If we do that, you're going to notice something annoying. So clear. We have a lot of new line characters. I don't know why, because when we look at the API response here, we see it as one nice little string. But for whatever reason, it returns with a ton of new line characters, and we do not want that. So we are going to pass the result of this into yet another replace call. If you recall, replace is going to look for matches of a regular expression, and then it's going to replace it with something new. So we're going to do replace. We're going to define a regular expression, and we want every single match of the expression to be replaced with our little space character here. So the way we can make sure that every match of a regular expression is matched here and replaced instead of just the first is we can add a G after our final slash here. This is just a flag or a regex modifier, and that's going to tell the replace function, hey, do this to every single match we find, not just the first one. And what are the matches, you may ask? Well, it's going to be new line characters, and the special character inside of regular expressions for new lines is \n. But we're going to be thorough, and we're going to also look for other ones that could potentially be there. So we can actually use this straight up and down line right now. I'm brain farting on what this is called, but we can use it as like an or condition. So we can find a /n for a new line, or a /r, or, and I think I also threw in, /f as well. Just to be super thorough, it's probably going to be /n each time for new lines, but we are being thorough with our code. So once again, we are getting the first entry or the first element from our flavor text entries array that matches our search function here in find. We are returning that, accessing the flavor text object inside of the returned element, and we're passing that object through replace, which is giving us a brand new string and putting it into the value of flavor text. So once again, if we log flavor text, actually I want to clear this first, get all that out of there. Now we get nice single lines. Perfect. So at this point, we can add our flavor text to our object. And how do we do that? Well, all we need to do is access the object. And remember, right now the object is Pokemon because we're inside of this for loop. And then we can define a new key for it. So I'm going to use bracket notation to do flavor dash text. And I'll close that off. And then I'll set that equal to flavor text. And note that I could easily have done this equal to this. So I'm kind of just taking 2 steps to make this as clear as possible, but I could make it more efficient and more compressed if I broke this down to 1 step. So we have our flavor text. What else can we get from our Pokemon-species endpoint? Well, we can get what's called the genera, and that's going to be our category, like, let's see if we can find it, Placid Pokemon right here. And we can also get the generation. So let's do the genera first. The genera is going to be a very, very similar situation where we need to search inside of this array for the element that has the en for English language name, which means we can pretty much copy and paste, except for we don't need this final replace function here. So we're going to go ahead and grab this, and we're going to do it one more time. And we're going to change flavor text to category. I'm using the Bulbapedia terms instead of that genus term that they use. But we now need to modify what we're accessing here. So it's going to be flavor data genera. And remember, genera is the name of the array here. So once again, we are going to be using that find method, and we're going to be looking once again for that end. And then we need to access, what do we need to access? The genus property inside of the matching array element. So coming back here, we want to change this to genus. And if I am not incorrect, it is already formatted the way we want. Placid Pokemon, perfectly good. So we don't need to do any sort of text massaging on that one. We can simply set Pokemon.category, which will define a new property of the object to category. Last but not least, let's get that generation. So let's do const generation equals flavor.data.generation. And let's check our API docs one more time. Get out of this array, find generation. And there it is. Generation is just an object with name as the key we want. So let's do generation.name. We'll go ahead and log that just to show how it works. Clear my terminal, please, and thank you. Run Node.js one more time. And my glitch instance is getting a little bit slow. There it goes. Generation -1. So the last thing we want to do, if we go back over to our little Pokedex here, is format our generations to look just like this. I just want the Roman numeral from the end, and I want to set it to uppercase. So let's look at our actual code here. And once again, let's walk through what we're doing in this line right here, because we are passing flavor.generation, our data.generation.name through 3 different functions. So we'll grab this. This will let us access the generation. Actually, we've already done it up here, so I didn't need to copy that. And now we first want to split it. So once again, we are splitting to get an array, and we're splitting on slash the dash right there. We're going to pass that result, which is going to be an array, into a method called pop. And pop, if we go over to our MDN, is not soda or Coke. I don't know where you're living and where you call it down there, but it's a method that removes the last element from an array and returns that element. And we know that if we are splitting on the dash, we're going to get generation as the first element, and then 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever as the final element. We want to get that last element. So we can use pop to get it, and then we're going to throw the popped element into to uppercase, which is a method that I think you can probably guess what it does. And then finally, we're going to go Pokemon.generation equals generation. And just for good measure, I'm going to add one more console log step. So when we're running through this in a giant loop, we also get a little bit of confirmation that we've fetched the flavor information for each Pokemon. So let's set this, and let's actually grab the name. So we'll do Pokemon.name as a variable in there. And with that, we are done getting all of this flavor, category, and generation information from the Pokemon species endpoint at PokeAPI. The last thing we need to do before we're done and we can run this bad boy for all the Pokemon and set off all the fireworks is send the new information we've just fetched to Notion. So once again, we have to start to modify this object that we are sending to Notion to handle the new data. So let's take a look at the 3 different object properties that we've created here. We have flavor text. That is going to be an actual paragraph that we're going to put on the page body. The category is a text field, but it's an actual text property in the database. And the generation is a select property. We can go back here and we can reference these. So generation is a select property. Category is a text property, but it is a database property. And then the flavor text simply goes on the page body. And I've actually formatted it as a block quote. And I just think that looks kind of nice. So let's start building this. And we'll start with our select block because that's going to be a bit easier. So going back over to the Notion API reference, I'm going to go to the page object and property values page here, and I'm going to look for select property values, and we can see how this kind of object is constructed. So once again, we are going to be zooming in so you can see this better. We're going to look for the name of the property, and then we're going to pass it an object called select, which contains an object with a name property. Cool. So our value, or our name here is generation, just like that, which means we can add ourselves yet another property here, and I'll just add it beneath type. So let's go generation, add our trailing comma. That's going to be an object called select, which itself contains one called name, and name will be Pokemon.generation. The next one is going to be our text field. So that one will be called category. And let's see how we define a text property. So I'll go back to our property values, zoom out to get my table of contents, and find a rich text property values subheading here. It's not title, that's the actual key value of the database, the name property. It's rich text here. And you can see you can do a lot with rich text, but to break it down, we're going to pass the name. Once again, zooming in, we're going to pass the name of the property. That is going to contain an object with a rich text array, and then this is really the rest that we need to look at here. That array contains elements, each of which are objects with type text and then a text object. So let's see if I can build that from memory. I probably can't, but we're gonna go ahead and try it anyway. So category is the name, and then I already forgot. Haven't done this enough times to truly remember it. And then that is gonna contain an array of objects where we have type, text, and text is going to contain an object with a property called content. And the content property is going to be Pokemon.category. If I could spell correctly, let's check that. Oh, and let's add our trailing comma before we forget. So the last thing we need to do, and I think this is truly the last thing we need to do, is append our flavor text in our children array. So remember from before, we added one child block, which is our bookmark to the Bulbapedia website. Well, above that, I actually want to create another paragraph object. So once again, back to our handy dandy reference, we're going to go zoom out. We're going to get to our block object page, and we're going to look at how paragraph blocks are constructed. And you will notice that it's very similar to the rich text object we just created in the category property. We have paragraph, we have type paragraph. These aren't named properties, so it's just paragraph. And then it's basically the same, except for I could put links in there if I wanted to. So once again, testing my own memory. Let's see if I can build this from scratch. Let's do, all right, object, block, type, paragraph. Paragraph is just like the other thing that I can't think of right now, but it does have that rich text array. And inside we have a array of objects. We have type text, and text is an object with content. Fingers are flying here. And the content is going to be Pokemon dot, not dot because we have to access this with bracket notation, flavor text. And I would like to put a space or a blank line between our flavor text and our object. And it just occurred to me that I did not want my flavor text to be a paragraph. I want it to be a block quote. So actually, I'm going to pass a blank line as a paragraph block. And above that, I'm going to add our flavor text as a block quote object. So let's go back to the block reference here. Let's find block quote or quote. Let's see what it's called. Quote blocks. And we can see that it is exactly the same as our paragraph blocks, except for type is quote, and then we put quote there. So coming back here, that means we can actually just copy this. Copying and pasting is every developer's best friend. And we can change this type to quote. We can change this object's key to quote. And then here we'll pass our Pokemon bracket flavor text. And that should be it, my friends. So the moment of truth has now arrived, we can come and uncomment our createNotionPage function call here. And let's go ahead and set this to, let's get a little bit feisty here, to 25. We're going to pull 25 Pokemon at once. So I want to first clear my little template demo here of all Pokemon that we've brought in so far. And I'm feeling confident. I think we've set the generation correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and hide no generation. And I'm going to expect that everything we pull is going to come into generation 1 right here. If it doesn't work, then I owe you nothing, because I'm not in the habit of doing weird bets with my audience when they can't talk to me synchronously. But I do think we are ready to actually do this. So drum roll, please. We'll clear our terminal. We will run this and we'll see what happens. Fetched information from PokeAPI, good. Fetched flavor information, good. And we've got pages coming in. So let's hop over to Notion and watch the fireworks. Look at that, perfectly come in with their generations, with their types, with their categories. Let's open up a random one. Do we have our flavor text? Yes, we do. We have our space here. We have our Bulbapedia link, testing that. It works. And we have just created a complete Pokedex generation script, which allows us to create a full Pokedex inside of Notion with absolutely no manual data entry whatsoever. And hopefully you've also learned tricks for actually using these APIs. Why don't we go ahead and start bumping this up here? So we've got 25. Let's do 26 here, and we'll go ahead and set this to 500, and we'll just let these results populate as I round out this video here. So index.js, we're fetching all kinds of Pokemon here. And you can see it takes a bunch of requests and then it kind of makes it wait for a couple of seconds. So you have like this sort of wavy thing going on here, but we are getting all of these Pokemon, which is pretty sweet. So once we start getting Notion page responses, I'll hop over back to Notion and we can watch things start to come in. But you have now completed this tutorial. I will have the code for this in the blog post linked down below. I will have my glitch instance, so you can actually, once again, remix the project. If you want to study it, if you want to mess around with it, you can do that. Or, you can build things from scratch. If you've just been watching this eating popcorn the whole time, maybe rewind and build things from scratch, because this, I think, is a great project for learning how to interface with APIs. I learned so much from this, and I have also learned that the PokeAPI is a wonderful API to play with if you want to start learning how to both play with APIs, but also learn how to code, learn how to manipulate data. We did a lot in this tutorial to manipulate and massage the data that we got, the raw data that we got from PokeAPI, to make sure that it's exactly what Notion needs and that it looks pretty and nicely formatted, which is pretty sweet. And yeah, hopefully this has sort of stimulated a bunch of ideas for you. There are like chart libraries, so you could start embedding charts of their stats in the body description. We didn't even get into how to access relations from the Notion API, so you could actually do like evolution chains if you wanted to. There's a lot we could do in the future. So if you liked this tutorial, let me know in the comments, share it with your friends, share it on Reddit or whatever you want to do. Give me signals that this is kind of the kind of stuff that you'd like to see, because this does take a very long time to do. It is very fun, but it is kind of technical content and it feels a little bit experimental compared to like the normal straight up vanilla Notion tutorials that we do. That being said, I do envision a future where the Thomas Frank Explains channel has multiple playlists on the homepage where there's like the basic stuff, the build guides, but then people can go down and find the section on API tutorials. And look at that, we have all of these Pokemon coming in. We've got all of their height, their weight. And one cool thing that I will note is that the height and weight values returned by the PokeAPI are actually in decimeters and decagrams, which I guess was good for the games and like, floating point values or whatever back in the day. But I've actually created little formulas that will translate them to kilograms and meters. And then if you go into a Pokemon, there are additional formulas for us Americans that want to do things with feet and inches and that kind of thing. So yeah, if you have questions, let me know in the comments down below. I will note that for this tutorial, I probably can't guarantee a lot of technical support. Number one, because I am not a JavaScript developer. Everything you heard me talk about in this video is the result of me starting my JavaScript journey in June of this year. So there's a lot of stuff that I actually don't know. I've just sort of like sprinted ahead for certain things like this here, and I was able to get this working. But hopefully with the highly commented code here in the glitch instance, I've commented literally every single line of code and explained what's happening. Hopefully with that, along with the video that I've just shot right here, and then all the references and resources I'm going to share with you below in the description, as well as in the markdown document right here. Hopefully you're going to have everything you need to learn how to build this and then how to extend it into the future. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, you can go over to thomasjfrank.com/fundamentals. That is currently the only place on my site that I have set up to sign up for my Notion newsletter. That's easy to share. So even if you're like super, pro with Notion, you don't need all the fundamental stuff. That's how you can get on my Notion Tips newsletter, where I first let you know, first and foremost, about tutorials like this when they drop. You'll be the first to know. And secondly, anything like extra cool that I want to share specifically with my email newsletter, or give beta access to templates that I'm developing before they go live to the public. People on my newsletter are going to be the first ones to know about that. So definitely get on the Notion Tips newsletter if you haven't already. Check out my templates. I've got Ultimate Brain, which is the complete and ultimate productivity system for Notion. If you want tasks and projects and notes in the same place, in one all-in-one dashboard, Ultimate Brain is the way to do it. And then I've got Creators Companion, which is great for content creators. And at the top of each of those pages, you will see a discount code that is temporarily available. You can use those. I'm offering discounts, and check those out, because what you will be able to do if you start learning a bit more about the API is extend those templates to do pretty much anything you want. See my previous tutorial for bringing YouTube stats into a template like Creators Companion, so you can see your views, your likes, and your comments. This Pokedex project, while super fun, is, I think, just an introduction to the world of coding and APIs, and there's so much more you can do, and you can do actual useful things for your life and your business using these tools. Last but not least, I don't promote this enough. It's totally free, but I haven't promoted it enough yet. If you are one of those people who wants to start writing formulas in Notion, taking your database skills to the next level, doing things like, say, converting meters and kilograms to inches and feet, just like this right here. If you want to understand what the heck is going on in this code block right here, I wrote an entire technical reference for Notion formulas. It has an article for every single operator, constant, and function that Notion's formula editor has as of today, which includes the syntax, it includes example formulas, it includes an example database that you can duplicate, it includes explained code for the examples. Literally everything that I could think to document about Notion formulas has been documented. So check that out over at notionformulareference.com. Also linked in the description down below. And I have been talking for like 3 hours at this point. So thank you again for watching. Like this video if you enjoyed it. There's no dislike button anymore, so sorry about that. Leave me a nasty comment if you didn't enjoy it, I guess. Let me know what you would improve about this. I'm always looking to improve my own knowledge, my own skills. I know for a fact that there's stuff in this code that it could be a lot better, but it is working. So it's at least a Rube Goldberg machine at this point. Let me know what I could do in the future. I would love to know if there's any tips and tricks you have off the top of your head. Follow me on Twitter, Tom Frankly, and ask questions there, and I will see you in the next one.